The first few mornings I woke up in the Philippines, I still reached for my phone before my eyes were even open. Old habit. Checking the time, checking the weather app, checking if my shift had changed. Then I'd hear the roosters outside and a dog barking somewhere down the road, and for a second or two my brain would try to place where I was. Not Sudbury, not my apartment, not the parking lot of the mill at 6 in the morning in February with my breath turning to fog the second I stepped outside. Somewhere warm, somewhere loud in a completely different way, and slowly the panic would drain out of me like water out of a tub. I'd lie there listening to the fan turning beside the bed and think, I don't have a shift anymore. There's nowhere I have to be. I didn't fully understand how tired I was until I stopped. That sounds simple when I say it out loud now. But for almost 35 years I hadn't stopped. Not really. I grew up in northern Ontario, the kind of place where you work because that's what you do, where your father worked the same mine his father worked, and nobody sat around asking whether they felt fulfilled. You got up, you put on your boots, you earned your keep. I did that. I did it well. I spent the better part of my adult life in industrial maintenance, long shifts, rotating schedules, the kind of work that doesn't leave much room for thinking too hard about whether your life is going the direction you wanted. You're too tired for that. You come home, you eat whatever's in the fridge, you fall asleep in front of the television, and then the alarm goes off again and you do it over. My wife Linda passed away 4 years before I moved. Cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, the apartment in Sudbury felt like something I was just storing myself in, not living in. My son David had moved out west to Kelowna years before. My daughter Marie was in Ottawa with her husband and the kids. I'd see them at Christmas and maybe once in the summer. I'd talk to them on the phone on Sundays. The rest of the week I worked, or I sat in the apartment watching hockey, or I drove to Canadian Tire for something I didn't really need just to have a reason to leave the building. I remember one Sunday in February. There was a wind chill warning on the radio, the kind where they tell you to limit time outdoors. And I was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold because I forgot to drink it. The news was talking about interest rates and grocery prices, and how retirement savings weren't going as far as they used to. I was 62 years old. I had my pension, I had some savings, Linda's life insurance had paid out, I wasn't desperate. On paper, everything looked manageable. But I remember sitting there at that table, thinking I couldn't remember the last morning I hadn't woken up feeling like there was a weight already sitting on my chest before my feet even touched the floor. Not grief exactly, not depression exactly, just a kind of gray heaviness that had become so normal I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a smell when you've been in the same room too long. I don't know when I started watching the YouTube videos. Sometime that winter. I'd been staying up later than I should. The apartment quiet in that particular way. Apartments get quiet when you used to share them with someone and now you don't. I was watching one thing, then another, and somehow I ended up watching a video of a man about my age walking through a market somewhere in the Philippines. Just walking. Not narrating anything important, not selling anything. Just moving through this narrow street full of vendors and tricycles and kids running between people's legs. And he stopped at a little stall to eat something, and he looked at the camera and smiled. That was it. That was the whole video almost. But something about it got into my head. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look like he was anywhere he was supposed to be other than exactly where he was. And I remember thinking about that for longer than I should have. About when was the last time I looked like that? Like I had nowhere to be but here. I told myself it was probably all edited to look pleasant. You know how it is online, everyone's life looks like a highlight reel. But I kept watching more of them. Not the flashy ones, not the ones about beaches and resorts. The ordinary ones. Someone cooking in a small apartment with a single burner and an electric fan going. Someone having breakfast outside at a plastic table, while neighbors walked by and said good morning. Someone sitting on a plastic chair in front of their place at night, doing nothing in particular, just watching the street. Nobody looked like they were trying to prove anything. I watched those videos for almost 2 years before I ever looked up a flight. The thought stayed quiet inside me for a long time. I didn't mention it to David when we talked. I didn't mention it to Marie. I knew how it would land. Dad's gone soft, Dad's having some kind of crisis, Dad's been alone too long, and this is what happens. And maybe part of me thought they'd be right. 62 years old, retired from Northern Ontario, what business did I have going halfway around the world? But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd be in the middle of something ordinary, driving to the grocery store, waiting for a prescription at Shoppers, sitting through another gray afternoon, and the image of that man at the market stall would come back. The smile, the way he wasn't rushing. One night in late March, I looked up flights. Just to know what it would cost. I told myself I was only curious. 4 months later, I was standing in the Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila with 2 checked bags and more anxiety than I'd felt since Linda was in the hospital. My shirt was already damp through. It was not yet 7 in the morning, and the heat outside felt personal, like it was specifically meant for me, like the air itself was trying to tell me I'd made a mistake. I hadn't told many people. David knew, mostly because I needed someone to have a key to the apartment. He'd been quiet on the phone when I explained it, the kind of quiet that means he was choosing his words carefully. He said he thought it was good I was doing something. He said to call when I landed. I could hear something in his voice that he wasn't saying, and I didn't push him on it because I wasn't entirely sure he was wrong. Marie was more direct. She called me 3 days before I left, and I could tell she'd been sitting on the call for a while. She said she was worried, not about the money, not about the logistics. She said she was worried I was running away from something instead of towards something. I told her maybe those were the same thing sometimes. She didn't find that reassuring, and honestly, I didn't have a better answer. The first week in the Philippines was not what I expected, in the way that nothing was what I expected. I'd settled on Dumaguete, a small city on Negros Oriental. I'd seen it in videos, read about it in expat forums. They called it a university town, which meant it was quieter than Manila or Cebu. Walkable, the kind of place where you might actually get to know your neighborhood rather than just pass through it. I found a small apartment through a contact I'd made in a Facebook group, a Canadian man from Winnipeg who'd been living there for 6 years and answered my questions with the kind of straightforward patience I appreciated. But nothing prepares you for the actual arrival. The heat I mentioned. The noise is the second thing. The Philippines is the loudest place I have ever been, and I say that as a man who spent 35 years around industrial equipment. Roosters at 3 in the morning, roosters at 4, roosters apparently all night just rotating shifts among themselves. Tricycles going past at all hours. Music from somewhere up the road. A dog that seemed to take my presence in the neighborhood as a personal insult. My first night I lay in the dark under the ceiling fan, which did not so much cool the room as redistribute the warm air around it, and I thought very clearly, I have made a significant error. But then I didn't leave. I'm not entirely sure why. Stubbornness, maybe. 40 years of Northern Ontario winters will make you stubborn about discomfort, at least. And small things started happening. There was a restaurant near the apartment. Nothing to look at, plastic chairs, and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and a television in the corner playing a Filipino soap opera at a volume designed for someone sitting in a different building. I went in the 3rd morning because I didn't know where else to go and I was too hungry to care. A woman came out from the kitchen, maybe 50 years old, and handed me the menu, and I stared at it too long because I recognized almost nothing on it. Instead of waiting impatiently, she pulled a chair over and sat beside me and started going through it. This one's like a stew. This one's grilled with vinegar. This is very good with rice. You should try this. She had nowhere to be. She spent probably 10 minutes helping me order breakfast. I sat there eating pork and rice at 7:30 in the morning with a fan blowing warm air at me from the corner. And I realized the last time someone had sat down to help me figure something out just because I needed help, without anything in it for them, without being in a hurry. I couldn't actually remember when that was. At home in Sudbury, I'd lived in the same building for 6 years after Linda passed. I knew the super by name, and I knew the woman in the apartment below me by her television shows. That was about it. People moved through lobbies and parking lots looking at their phones, or not looking at anything. Nobody was unfriendly. Nobody was anything, really. Everyone was just managing their own life in their own separate box. In the Philippines, people acknowledge each other. I know that sounds like such a small thing. The security guard outside the convenience store nodded at me every single morning within 4 days of my arriving. The man at the little sari-sari store around the corner knew my face before he knew my name and knew my name before the week was out. People asked where I was from. They asked if I'd eaten. They asked if I was adjusting okay. An older Filipina woman from 2 doors down knocked one afternoon to bring me mangoes because she had too many and figured I might like some. I stood in my door holding a bag of mangoes from a stranger, feeling something I couldn't quite name. I think it was just the simple shock of being noticed. I want to be honest because I think a lot of people who write about this kind of move either make it sound like paradise or make it sound like misery, and the truth is more mixed and more interesting than either. The Philippines is not easy. The heat alone is a genuine daily challenge, and I don't want to minimize that for anyone thinking about it. By noon most days my energy was roughly half what it was at 8 in the morning. Visa paperwork is its own particular kind of bureaucratic theater. The internet went out constantly. I got sick in my second month, the kind of sick that keeps you horizontal for 3 days wondering what you've done to yourself. There were afternoons I walked home from running errands genuinely annoyed, thinking about Tim Hortons and clean sidewalks and gas stations that took tap payments. But here's what I didn't expect. Even on those days, I still felt more present than I had in years in Sudbury. Somewhere around the 2-month mark, there was a brownout. Not unusual, I'd already learned. The power just went out, no warning, middle of the evening. The fan stopped. The lights went off. Outside, I could hear the neighborhood reacting, which is to say not much. A few dogs. Kids yelling somewhere. I went outside because the apartment without the fan was genuinely not breathable and found that half the street had done the same thing. People had dragged chairs out. Someone had a little battery-powered lantern going. A man 3 doors down was grilling something on a small charcoal setup he'd apparently kept ready for exactly this situation. My neighbor, a retired teacher named Efren, waved me over. I barely knew him at that point. We'd exchanged greetings a few times, nothing more. But he waved me over like it was the obvious thing to do and handed me a San Miguel and introduced me to the 3 other people sitting there, and within 20 minutes, I was eating grilled fish with my hands in the dark. While people switched back and forth between English and Cebuano faster than I could track. Someone asked if Canada had brownouts. I said if the power went out for more than 2 hours back home, people would be calling the news stations. Everyone laughed. Someone else asked if it was really true it got to -40 in the winter. I said yes. More laughter. The kind that isn't cruel, just genuine surprise at how differently other people live. I sat out there for almost 3 hours. At some point I realized I hadn't thought about anything back home the entire evening. Not the apartment. Not the bills I had on automatic payment. Not the investment account I checked too often. Not David's voice on the phone being careful with me. Just this street, this small light, this fish, these people. It was the first evening in longer than I can honestly calculate that I hadn't spent some part of it bracing for the next thing. The holidays were when it got hard. I knew they would be, and they still got me. I'd made it to December. I was doing better than I'd expected in most ways. I had a routine, I knew the neighborhood, I had a few people I'd exchange real conversation with. Efren and I had taken to having coffee in the morning sometimes, and there was a retired Australian man named Graham, who I'd met through a Facebook group for expats, and who I'd have a meal with once a week or so. I was not lonely in the way I'd been lonely in the Sudbury apartment, but December in the Philippines is full of families. Christmas is serious there, more serious than anything I'd expected. Lights go up in early November. Music plays from every shop. Families are everywhere. Extended families, grandparents and cousins, and kids in their best clothes. And I was video calling Marie on Christmas Eve, watching my grandkids open one present, early the way we'd always done, their tradition since they were small. And they held things up to the camera, and I said the right things and smiled the right way, and when the call ended, I sat in my apartment and felt the distance in a way that was almost physical. I went outside because I couldn't stay in. It was warm, there were lights strung up along the road, music from somewhere, the smell of food cooking, and I stood there on the sidewalk feeling further from home than I'd felt since I arrived, which is saying something because I was 10,000 kilometers from Sudbury by a conservative estimate. Then someone knocked on my door. I'd gone back inside by then. I opened it and it was my neighbor from across the hall, a woman named Cora, who I'd spoken to maybe 4 or 5 times in passing. She was holding a plastic container covered in foil and she said her family was eating and I should come. Just like that. No ceremony, no big invitation. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd tell someone the bus was coming and they should hurry up. I tried to say I didn't want to intrude. She looked genuinely puzzled by that. She said it was Christmas. I went. Her apartment was maybe half the size of mine, and there were 11 people in it. Kids on the floor, aunties in the kitchen, her husband's brother watching basketball on a small television in the corner. Food everywhere. The table wasn't big enough, so people were eating on their laps, on stools, leaning against the counter. Cora's mother, who was 70-something and tiny and sharp-eyed, took one look at me and pointed at a chair and said, "Sit and eat." So I sat and ate. I probably understood 40% of what was said that evening. They were kind about speaking English around me, but they'd get going in Cebuano, and I'd just watch and eat, and someone would glance over and summarize, and then they'd all move on. At some point, one of the kids put on karaoke. I was handed the microphone. I am not a singer. I put that clearly on the record right now. I sang 3 lines of a Gordon Lightfoot song before everyone started laughing hard enough that I gave up and sat down, and honestly, that was the best moment of the whole evening. I drove home to Sudbury in June. I'd been in the Philippines about 8 months, and I figured I should check on the apartment, deal with some paperwork, see Marie and the kids. I told myself it would feel good to be home. It felt strange almost immediately. The Toronto airport was the first thing. I've been through Pearson hundreds of times in my life, and I've never thought much about it. But walking through it after 8 months away, I noticed something different about the energy. Not busy. Busy isn't the right word. Tense. Everyone moving with this low-grade urgency that I'd apparently stopped noticing when I lived in it. People not making eye contact. Someone behind me sighing loudly because the person ahead of him in line wasn't moving fast enough. A woman on her phone having a stressed conversation about something at work while she dragged her luggage and didn't look up once. I stood at the baggage carousel and watched all of this and thought, I used to feel like this all the time. I used to carry this everywhere I went. I didn't know it had a weight until I put it down. Sudbury was fine. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. I had dinner with old colleagues twice, met up with my neighbor Ted for a beer, spent a few days in Ottawa with Marie and the kids, and David flew in from Kelowna for the weekend. That part was good. Watching my grandkids in their own space, sitting at Marie's kitchen table with her and David and her husband Paul, after the kids were in bed, staying up too late talking. That was the part I'd missed. Not the country itself. Them. But I remember standing in the cereal aisle at Loblaw's one afternoon, surrounded by more varieties of the same basic product than anyone needs, and feeling an exhaustion that made no sense, given that I was just buying cereal. Everything was so loud and bright and fast and full. The parking lot was full of people who looked like they were completing tasks rather than living lives. I bought what I needed and went back to the apartment and sat for a while, feeling something I couldn't quite place. I didn't miss my life there. I missed people. That's a different thing. I missed David's voice in person, not through a phone. I missed sitting at Marie's table. I missed the particular way my grandkids said Grandpa when they saw me. But I didn't miss the pace. I didn't miss the sound of a January morning, the furnace running, the traffic already building on the road outside, the sense that the day was already pulling at you before it had properly started. When my return flight landed in Cebu and I walked outside, and the heat hit me like walking into a wall, I realized I'd relaxed. Just like that, shoulders dropped, jaw unclenched, something in my chest that had been quietly bracing itself for 2 weeks came loose. I took a taxi to the ferry and sat there watching the city go past and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was going somewhere rather than coming back from somewhere. That was when I knew this wasn't going to be temporary. I want to be honest about the harder parts because I think men my age, men from where I come from, don't always talk honestly about what it costs to make a change like this, and that silence doesn't serve anyone. Getting older overseas is not without its fears. Healthcare here is genuinely affordable in a way that still surprises me when I see the bills. I've had blood work done for less than I'd have paid in parking at a hospital in Ontario. Dentistry, especially. But there is always a quiet understanding sitting somewhere in the back of your mind that if something serious happened, truly serious, you'd probably want to be somewhere with a different level of care and closer to family. I don't think that fear ever fully goes away. I've made my peace with it. I keep travel insurance. I stay on top of my health checks. But I'd be lying if I said it never crossed my mind. And loneliness is real, even when you've built something. Even when you have Efren for morning coffee and Graham for occasional dinners and Cora bringing you holiday food and a street that knows your face. There are nights when I wish I could drive to David's, or that Marie and the kids were a 20-minute car ride away instead of a 12-hour flight. Grief doesn't observe geography. Missing Linda doesn't stop because I'm somewhere warm. Sometimes it's sharper here because there's no noise to cover it, no routine to fill the space. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. For 35 years I lived my life in a way that looked right from the outside. Worked hard, paid into my pension, raised decent kids with Linda, owned my responsibilities. I did everything the way you're supposed to do it. And I got to 62 years old and I couldn't remember the last morning I'd woken up without that weight already on me. That invisible weight, not grief specifically, not stress specifically, just the accumulated heaviness of a life lived mostly on autopilot, mostly in service of what came next, rarely just here, just now, just this. That's what the Philippines gave me that I didn't expect to find. Not cheap rent, not warm weather, not some fantasy version of retirement. Just time to actually be inside my life instead of managing it from a slight distance. I stopped checking my phone first thing every morning, not because I made a rule about it, just because there stopped being a reason. The habit fell away on its own. I started noticing things I'd walked past for decades without registering. The way light comes through banana leaves in the morning. The sound a street makes when it's just beginning to wake up. That particular early quiet before the tricycles get going. The way a good cup of coffee sits when you have nowhere to be while you drink it. My world got smaller in the sense that my daily territory is a neighborhood rather than a city. And my daily concerns are pretty simple. Groceries, coffee, keeping up with David and Marie, staying healthy. But my life got bigger in the ways that matter to me now. I have neighbors who know my name and check on me. I have mornings that don't start with anxiety. I have evenings where I can sit outside with nothing in particular going on and not feel guilty about the nothing. That last one took me the longest to get used to, I think. The guilt. I grew up in a culture that treated stillness as laziness and rest as something you had to earn. Even after I retired, I'd feel vaguely wrong sitting still for too long. Part of my brain always thought I should be doing something, fixing something, preparing for something. In the Philippines, I watched people sit, just sit, outside their homes, outside stores, at the end of the day when the light was going orange. Families together, friends together, sometimes just alone, just present, in the neighborhood. And slowly that started to feel less like laziness and more like sanity. I think a lot of people in Canada right now are more exhausted than they're letting on. I say this not as someone looking down from somewhere better, but as someone who was one of them for longer than I understood. The cost of living is punishing. The pace of cities is relentless. People work hard their whole lives and still feel behind. Housing costs are something Linda and I couldn't have imagined when we bought our first place in Sudbury. And there's this social performance running constantly in the background. The invisible scoreboard of what you own and what your kids are doing, and whether your retirement is going to be enough, and whether you've made the most of everything. Even relaxing becomes something people have to do correctly. I was part of all of that. I don't say it to judge it. I understand it from the inside. But I'm not inside it anymore, and the difference is something I feel in my body. I sleep differently. I breathe differently. I catch myself smiling at nothing, which would have seemed strange to me in Sudbury. I start most mornings on the small balcony of my apartment with coffee, listening to the neighborhood come awake, and I don't reach for my phone right away, and whatever I'm thinking about is usually right here, not 12 steps ahead of itself. My daughter Marie asked me a few months ago, on one of our Sunday calls, whether I was actually happy or just convinced myself I was. It was a fair question, and I appreciated her asking it plainly. I told her I wasn't sure happy was exactly the right word. Happy sounds like it should feel all the time a certain way. What I felt was more like settled, like I finally stopped bracing for something, like I was actually living the life I was inside rather than slightly separate from it, managing it, waiting for it to get to the part where I could relax. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, Dad," and I think she meant it. I don't know if this is where I'll stay forever. I'm 65 now. Life changes, health changes, family changes. I try not to pretend I have the whole thing mapped out because Linda taught me without meaning to that life doesn't stay the shape you expect. Maybe in a few years I'll need to be closer to home. Maybe something will pull me back. I hold that possibility honestly, and I don't fight it. But for now, when I wake up in the morning, before I'm fully awake, before I've moved or opened my eyes, I lie there in the warm dark with the fan going and the street outside just starting to make its first sounds. And for a second or two, I just listen. Roosters, a motorbike, someone sweeping somewhere down the road, and there's no panic. No weight already waiting for me. No sense that I'm already behind before the day has started. Just this, just here, just alive inside the morning. And at 65, that is not a small thing. It's actually just about everything.